You're listening to the Bear in Mind podcast, episode number 92.
A podcast uncovering identity, color, and love, where driving yourself crazy is totally sane and curable. Now your host, T. Vias.
I was surprised by the number of words that we have created to describe what happens in a relationship. And this could be for romantic relationships, but also for friendships. I think they're also equally relevant, like benching, like ghosting, like the slow fade, orbiting, submarining, zombieing. There were so many words that I discovered on the internet that usually it's in an article about dating, what happens in dating today. There were some things that have happened over the course, I would say, the year in some of my friendships where when I was reading the article describing these terms, I was like, oh, this is kind of the context, or well, this is what's been happening in my friendships. And then I could understand that this is also what has happened in my past dating relationships. So whatever term you're identifying with in your relationship, here's what I have for you today, is that no matter how you see the relationship right now, whether you think somebody is ghosting you, breadcrumbing you, all of these orbiting you, is that you actually have the power to decide the exact kind of relationship that you want with anyone. And that goes for friendships. That goes for the person that you secretly have a crush on. This can really throw people off. When I say this to my friends, like, you get to decide what kind of relationship you can have with that other person, they're like, okay, like, T, you're not actually all with it there. And I have to say that maybe it sounds a little far-fetched to say that you get to decide the relationship. Then I want to hear you out. I have an example, and I talk about how I decided this in episode number 90, Love Decisions, where I finally put this into practice in a relationship where I was feeling really confused, where I didn't know what was happening. And, some of these terms applied in a friendship. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, I get to decide the relationship. And then I did it. And now I feel like I'm not confused. Like, I'm not in this place of wondering what's going to happen, sitting on the edge. Okay, what do I do if this happens, or I get this message or this text and things like that? And I think it's really helpful to see this play out in specifics. So I have this friend, and the term that probably relates more to what has been going on is the term benching. And it's where you have a rhythm of communication. Like, let's say you always talk to somebody once a week, or you text each other every single day. And then all of a sudden, it's like the rhythm of that communication changes. Instead of texting, maybe it's 5 times a week, there's no text for like 3 weeks or something, or a month or 2 months. And when there is a noticeable change for you in the consistency of your communication, your brain can go in different places. Because I know my brain went to like, oh, maybe I did something wrong. And that doesn't need to always necessarily be the case that you did something wrong, because that's where that term benching comes from, as if they're like punishing you because you didn't do something. And that could be the case, that maybe they're upset with you because of something you said or did. And they're not wanting to talk to you, maybe because they're dealing with their own emotions about it before they address it with you. There's all these several reasons, and you can get lost in why that's happening, why all of a sudden you notice a change in how you've been communicating. You can spend a lot of time there, and you can even then beat yourself up for saying, well, maybe I didn't do something wrong. Maybe they're going through something that I don't know about, and, oh, I'm being totally unrealistic and not a good friend because maybe my friend is going through something where they need to deal with it. He or she needs to deal with it. And I'm sitting here going, well, why has the pattern, the consistency of our communication changed? And now here's the question that I think that you can ask yourself whenever there is, ghosting, benching, whatever, all of these terms is, the question is, how do you want to show up as a friend? How do you want to show up as a romantic partner or an acquaintance, you're dating somebody? How do you want to show up as you in these situations, no matter how they have been presented to you, no matter how the texts are sent to you or the frequency of those texts, the inconsistency, et cetera, et cetera? How do you want to show up? What is the type of person you want to be? And that is often a harder question to answer because now you're not looking at, okay, what is happening with my friend, with this person I'm dating? Oh, maybe something happened. Maybe I did something wrong. You're looking at yourself and you're saying, how do I want to show up? And with my friend, where all of a sudden the communication patterns changed and it became really inconsistent to where we would touch base about once a week or every couple weeks to months, 2-3 months. There was no communication. And so the question isn't going to be dependent on what's happening in their life. So let's say you find out the reason that there's a drop in communication. Let's say there was a family emergency and there's stuff going on and you decide that's a good reason for them not speaking to you and you'll let it go in your mind. And what if the contrary was true? What if they just weren't communicating with you because, they didn't communicate with you and they were going out with their other friends and not bothering to text you like they normally do? And that could happen, but the question comes back to, how do you want to show up in any of those situations? Whether they quote unquote have a good enough reason for you, if it was some sort of emergency or illness or anything like that, versus if they just decided, I'm not communicating with you as much. Because if your answer is going to be dependent on how somebody else behaves, you will constantly be changing how you show up in your relationships dependent on somebody else's behavior. And you give away all your power, and then you also are giving away all your decision power and what type of relationship you want with that person. So back to the example of, let's say somebody stops texting you as frequently and there's a family emergency and you're like, oh, that's why they've been dealing with that. And you show up like how you've always been showing up in the friendship and you decide that's good enough. Okay, so you show up how you want to show up. And then let's say the opposite's true. They've been going out with other friends, their life's continuing, they're going through stuff and you're like, oh, so they aren't taking the time to text me or something like that goes through your mind. You realize that there was no kind of family emergency. How do you show up? Do you show up angry at that? Do you show up that I don't want to talk to them because they didn't make it, they weren't talking to me? So you do the same kind of benching back to them. You decide, well, now I'm not going to really talk to you anymore. So when that friend who has benched you contacts you, do you then show up slightly angry? Do you give one-word answers? Do you not tell your story? Because normally, if you were in the friendship, you would show up and tell your story, you would talk, and you would chat. And what I did is I decided to show up how I would show up. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't notice that, I'm not going to text somebody over and over again if they're not responding to my text. That's not what I mean. That comes from a very different place. That doesn't come from a place of how I want to show up in the relationship. I want to show up from a place of genuine warmth and caring and love to the other person. And that's also true for me. I want to show up with that sort of loving and caring emotion for myself too. So in this situation with my friend, where all of a sudden our communication became inconsistent and infrequent, when she decided to communicate with me, I showed up the same way. I still answered questions. I still responded how I would with that kind of love. And it didn't mean that after that I went back to texting her the same way or trying to, keep, I would say, poking at somebody if they don't really want to communicate with me. I still told my story. I still showed up how I wanted to. And then I said, okay, I'm going to show up, tell my story, talk to the other person, and then they get to choose to respond back to what I've shared in my life with them. And that's it, with no expectation. I didn't share my story or show up for who I am with this expectation that the frequency of our communication is therefore going to change because I show up the way I wanted to show up. So if you go back to that question, how do you want to show up, regardless of how somebody else behaves? Do you want to show up with someone that is going to be dependent on how somebody else behaves in that relationship, or do you get to show up exactly as the type of person you want to show up without having expectations of the other person's behavior? Because when you're able to answer that question and decide, I'm going to show up as this loving, caring person to myself and to the other person, you'll find that you don't have to worry about what's going on with that other person. You don't have to come from a place of anger. You can show up and be you and decide that that's the relationship that you're going to have. That relationship of being a loving and caring person to yourself and to somebody else. That's all I have for you this week. I'll check back with you next.
Thanks for listening. Listen for a new episode next Tuesday by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. Bye for now.